today. Thank you so much, Alicia, for such a warm welcome. As stated, my project is entitled, or my presentation rather, is entitled Portraiture and Indigeneity. However, before getting into the presentation, I wanted to explain to you the reason why I decided to undertake this work specifically. So with that being said, I'm going to share with you my positionality as a creative, as a researcher. You would have been listening to an overview of my biography. However, my story actually started at 11 years old. I first began learning about my Indigenous culture at 11, not through the formal education system in St. Vincent, but through elders who saw that enough was enough and decided to come back to St. Vincent to teach Garifuna language and culture. So these are a couple images on the Portrait Project website, which we'll delve into later. But the image on the left is actually me in this white garment here, just a couple years after entering secondary school. And the image on the right is in 2023 with myself and fellow Garifuna youths, as well as my elder, Miss Eleanor Castillo Bullock. For several years after attending the Yugokure Garifuna Revival program in St. Vincent, I immediately after finishing college and even during college, during the summer vacation, would teach Garifuna language, culture, and music to children at our National Public Library in St. Vincent. So these are some images from those instances. And the children that I would teach are much younger than I would have been when learning about the Garifuna culture. So the age group ranged from about 6 to 13 years old. And here they would learn music, Garifuna history, Garifuna culture, all aspects of Garifuna within this library space for several weeks during the summer. And this project sparked the realization that I needed to create a platform, and that platform became the Portrait Project. So now I am going to switch back to the project screen. Here we go. So the main question I had for this project is, how does art function as revisionism? So the correlation between revisionism, art, Indigenous research, decolonization, and activism is a complex topic that, as we know, can span across disciplines and areas of study. So my presentation and my project aims to explore the interconnectedness of these concepts, delving into ways in which they intersect and influence one another. By examining the historical, cultural, and social context of these elements, we can gain a deeper understanding on their implications for our present-day society. Okay, so what is my conceptual framework? Now, I'm presenting all this research-heavy information simply because the Portrait Project was one of my final projects before I graduated UWI. And this was initially supposed to be a project that I had a single semester to work on, about 3 weeks, and it spanned and rippled into something a bit bigger than the 3 weeks. So all of these conceptual questions are questions that I had upon conducting initial research. So what is the correlation between revisionism, Indigenous research, decolonization, art, and activism? What are the constructs of identity and representation that govern the ways that Indigenous people and communities in the Caribbean function? And we'll answer these questions throughout the presentation. So now, in the context of history, revisionism plays a crucial role in expanding our understanding of the past and addressing the biases and omissions present in traditional historical accounts. This process of reevaluating and reinterpreting history can lead to a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of the past, and it also sheds light on the experiences of marginalized communities, like our Indigenous communities, and challenging dominant narratives. Now, I also had the question about what is art exactly? Because for the Portrait Project, I looked at different art mediums and different Indigenous people across the region and how they have either expressed themselves through art or used art to solidify their indigeneity. So through the various art forms such as visual arts, literature, and music, performance, artists and even common people can contribute to the process of revisionism by amplifying marginalized voices and promoting a more comprehensive understanding of history. Now, I say this showing you images of how Indigenous people have been depicted in the past to show you later in the presentation how my people in Indigenous communities here in the Caribbean have chosen to reimagine themselves through this concept of portraiture, where they're basically saying, I see how we've been represented in historical texts, Christopher Columbus's journals and journals of Thomas Thistlewood, who is known in Barbados. But I'm choosing to identify as something else. So, with that being said, Indigenous research is a method that I chose specifically for undertaking this project. So I wasn't exactly going to go and create a whole aspect of research without interacting with people from Indigenous communities. Indigenous research encompasses methodologies and knowledge systems that are rooted in our perspective. Rather than looking at research from the outside in, it looks at Indigenous individuals from our communities and not just looking at what white people or predominantly white people, I would say, or Eurocentric ideals of what indigeneity would have looked like. Also, for the purpose of this research project, I decided to look at decolonization. Especially with the talk of reparations within our communities, I find that we often don't have a central understanding of what decolonization is. So I'm going to define it. Decolonization involves challenging and dismantling the enduring legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and oppression. It encompasses various processes of reclaiming Indigenous sovereignty, challenging colonial structures and ideologies, and promoting social, political, and cultural transformation. In context with this definition of decolonization, I'm choosing to engage in revisionist approaches to history and knowledge production. This form of decolonization aims to challenge and transform the entrenched colonial narratives and power structures that continue to shape our societies today. So these power structures, for example, would include the constant fight and battles that indigenous people across the region have to undertake to simply secure lands that are rightfully theirs. Human rights violations that have consistently been brought to light in Belize and Honduras, for example, where indigenous Garifuna people are being outed from lands on the coastlines in order for them to be developed for coastal development of resorts and tourist attractions. So indigenous Garifuna people in these regions are being separated from their relationship with oceans, with rivers, with streams nearby. And this is something that has been going on for years. And that now leads me to activism. Activism encompasses a broad range of actions and movements aimed at promoting social, political, and cultural change. It involves advocating for justice, equality, and the rights of marginalized communities and challenging oppressive systems and structures. So, activism in this case intersects with revising these historical narratives of Indigenous people. And you would see, for example, if you're somebody who loves to read like I do, in Christopher Columbus's journals when he details his first interactions with Taino people, it was a very racist overview of their idea of religion and cosmology, because at that time he was looking at their religion to find ways to colonize these quote-unquote barbaric people. Even the ways in which Kalinago people, their name to colonizers was Caribs. And we know for a fact that that name was not something that they chose. It was a name given to them. And it means man-eater or cannibal. And unfortunately, it's a term that continues to plague us to this day, even in the name Caribbean. The first part of it says Carib. Even in the term West Indies, we're not West Indies. We're not exactly Caribbean either. And that's something that always baffled me because I wondered if we were to come up with a term for what we call the quote unquote Caribbean, what would that look like? And that in itself is a form of activism. Now, in terms of this conceptual framework, I was curious about what are the constructs of identity and representation that govern Indigenous communities in the Caribbean. So in my research, I noticed that the Caribbean, and by extension, Caribbean identities have always been interpreted through a metropolitan core, meaning the Eurocentric or European worldview, and the periphery world systems view, meaning periphery meaning people who conducted the research and are from the communities that they're conducting research on. But how are the Caribbean and Caribbean indigenous identities packaged, consumed, and experienced? I had this question because you would note that in our region, a lot of indigenous practices are being commercialized. So you see drum circles at cruise ship terminals, and you see dances being performed on stage without knowing the actual importance of these practices. So continuing, in a spatial context, the conception of the Caribbean and Caribbean indigenous identities have been remarked as without racial multiplicity, with a narrative of indigenous absence and plantation modernity. Now, the shorter way of saying this is that a lot of times indigenous people within the Caribbean have been grouped into one single whole, with the assumption that all indigenous groups are the same. There is also an assumption for individuals residing without the Caribbean that all Caribbean islands are the same. And I'm pretty sure, even saying this to my beloved Jamaicans, when you've traveled somewhere outside of the Caribbean and you say that you're from the Caribbean, one of the first things people say is, "Are you Jamaican? You don't have a Jamaican accent. You must be Jamaican, though." And that is something that has rippled into our indigenous communities. But we are not always the same. We have our unique practices, our unique ways of being and living. Now, my question was, so what does indigeneity look like? And in an attempt to answer this question, I have before you two engravings that were done by a popular artist within the 1700s called Agostino Brunais. He did several engravings of indigenous people, but most notably in front of the screen, these art pieces I have before you are what he called a family of Charabis, drawn from the life in the island of St. Vincent. And this is a depiction of Kalinago people in St. Vincent at the time. That's the image on the left. And we also have an engraving of a family of Garifuna people, most notably Joseph Satuye Chatuye and his wives, our paramount chief of chiefs in St. Vincent. And these depictions, you would have seen them throughout the presentation, are what many have used to identify Indigenous people in the region. But what does indigeneity look like? In what instances have our bodies and the arts been used as archives for documentation of oral and tangible history, enabling the reconstruction of Indigenous identities? How are Indigenous identities constructed around the matter of global and international understandings of the region? And contrary to what most believe, we are not extinct. There have been a re-representation of Indigenous communities within the Caribbean region, and while there is a concept of anti-Indigeneity and erasure, as seen in Garifuna communities, where, due to the abduction of Garifuna elders, young Garifuna people are refusing to identify as Garifuna on a census. Therefore, it is appearing as if we're having a population decline. Meanwhile, our Garifuna youths are simply scared of being themselves. In research on Indigenous communities, in archaeological findings, in ethnographic research, we have constantly been demystified. And that's something that I hope for Grenada, because when I visited recently, I was told that there are several areas where artifacts have been removed or even sold, or not even documented to begin with. And my question to that is, has the subdivision of the New World relegated Caribbean Indigenous identities to neat boxes of existence, or in some cases, extinction? with additional theories of the Caribbean proposed in understandings of the plantation society and the dependency theory and creolization and differentiations between gender and religion and culture. How do we understand how art and body are used as historical data? How do we define who we are? You can see on this map we have all our indigenous names and representations, yet we are often lumped into one whole, the Caribbean. So rather than the Kalinago, the Taino, the Mestizo, the Mayan, the Garifuna, we have a single representation of the Caribbean. And rather than the indigenous names of our communities, we have single representations of those countries. So St. Vincent, for example, is no longer referred to as Urumi or Hairuna. It is now St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we have regions within our country, for example, Barley, the Bekwai, Leyu, that are indigenous names that have held. But we also have very European names such as Pembroke, Richmond Park, and icons named after colonizers. So that's something that we should think about. Why are we using our sculptures and statues to glorify colonizing entities rather than our indigenous people? And that leads me to the question of portrait or portraiture. So the relationship between portraiture or portrait and art doesn't necessarily always reference a pictorial representation. In my use, it references likeness, references or descriptions in literature, in books that have informed understandings of indigeneity and the illumination of real people, real indigenous people, to depict the meaning of personal stories and events as a narrative framework for analysis. The Portrait Project aims to revise and examine the distortion of indigenous communities in the Caribbean region and propose a method of self-identification through ethnographic research and the creative arts. Now, the question comes, a lot of questions, I know. What is art? For the purpose of this project, I did not limit the concept of art to simply drawings or paintings. I expanded it to the people that I interviewed to any form of creative expression. So anything from ceramics to pottery to animation to film to poetry to spoken word and to dance. Because I'm interested in the relationship between the intent behind original representation and how it has been consumed, and how we as Indigenous people have chosen to restructure representation through creative pathways. So on the left here, you would see this image represented as the first known depiction of cannibalism in the New World. It's an engraving by Johann Forcher for an edition of Amaringo. And in the original caption, which was in German, the figure represents to us, it says, "This figure represents to us the people and island which have been discovered by the Christian king of Portugal or by his subjects. The people are thus naked, handsome, brown, well shaped in body. Their heads, necks, arms, private parts, feet of men and women are all a little covered in feathers. The men also have many precious stones in their faces and breasts. No one also has anything, but all things are common. And the men have as many wives who please them, be they mothers, sisters, or friends. Therein they make no distinction. They also fight with each other. They also eat each other, even those who are slain, and hang the flesh of them in the smoke. They became 130 years old and have no government." The caption for this, the original caption for this image depicts the sheer barbaric nature of understanding or trying to understand Indigenous individuals in the region. Imagine entering a space. You're not speaking their language, you're not doing their customs, and attempting to say that I am better than you because you have a different way of doing things. Isn't that interesting? Food for thought. So with all that being said, I want to share with you the findings of the portrait project by showing you the website and what exactly were the fruits of our labor, I would have to say, and how did I come about going through this project. So right now I'm on the website of the Portrait Project, and I have the stories of several individuals within the Caribbean region. I have individuals from Belize, St. Vincent, Dominican Republic, also from Belize and the US by extension, and of course, Dominica. And the first story that I'm going to show you is April. April is from Belize, born in Belmopan. She's a proud Garifuna and mestizo within the field of archaeology and anthropology of Mesoamerica and the Andes. She has a love for cultural, creative, and educational sustainability that transcends all realms in her personal life and in a professional capacity as a director of the Heritage Education Network Belize. And the Heritage Education Network Belize, I must proudly say, is an all-female-led network that aspires to promote learning Indigenous communities and learning their cultures. When I interviewed April, she was sharing about her experience during a study abroad. One of the things that she stated is, I think that the creative arts is the identity of certain cultural groups. I don't know if you know any Garifuna person that does not sing, that does not dance, that does not paint in some way, shape, or form. Their influence is their culture. Every aspect of their movement, of their creativity, is a stem of who they are as a people. I don't know if there could ever be one without the other. And I'm playing this video as well from my interview with April.
Okay, so I was studying abroad for like 2 years, 2015, 2017, and I decided to take a trip to Prague. And I was walking, just taking in the city. This is a new place. I've never been here before. It's Europe, totally different from what we're used to in the Caribbean, and taking my stroll, really. And I'll never forget, this was like about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is how much this stuck to me. I'm walking down this alley, trying to find like a place to eat. And I'm hearing this song, right? And it sounds so familiar. And I'm walking but in my mind, it sounded familiar, but also the other part of my mind said it can't be the song that I am listening to. Like, it has to just be maybe something similar, but I'm following the song because I have to know what it is, what's happening, right? So I followed this song and I took a corner, and it's this like beat down Turkish supermarket in the middle of Prague. The radio is playing, and it's Paul Nabor Naguyani. Oh my God. And I'm just there like, the guy, I'm assuming he was the owner. I don't know. He was working there. He's an older gentleman. He's sweeping and he's humming to the beat of this song. And I wanted to cry because it was around the same time that he had passed. And I'm just there completely in shock because in my mind, this is home. This is PG. This is Barranco home in Beach, and it's playing in a country that I didn't even really know existed until I went to school.
So that is a snippet of my interview with April. And imagine you're in this completely different place, vastly, vastly different from your home country, yet you're hearing your Indigenous music playing from somebody who doesn't even speak Garifuna. So at the ending of this interview, April shared with me that she immediately called her parents and was like, I feel so completely at home because I heard music. I heard art playing on the sound system that made me feel more comforted in the space that I am. And that is to show you the sheer magnitude of the arts in revising Indigenous communities and understanding Indigenous communities. Now, the next person that I'm going to show you is a Taino individual from the Dominican Republic, and their name is Desan. Their pronouns are they and them, and Desan is both Taino and Quisqueyano. They're an artist and illustrator using digital work to incorporate their indigenous culture and general Caribbean aspirations. Desan is a caretaker and preserver of indigenous culture and history, and in doing so, they battle erasure, external media, and misinformation to advocate for the respectful and accurate representations of their ancestors. Now, when I reached out to Desan and told them that this is a project that I want to do, and if they had a submission, Desan shared with me this beautiful piece of digital art that they had created. It is untitled and is a piece of graphic art merging Taino symbolisms with a modern medium. So they said, I attached an image of my favorite piece. It really represents how, as an Indigenous person, my art has really grounded me and made me more confident in my indigeneity. It represents my love for my island, our petroglyphs, and my connection with my ancestral home. And this is one of Desan's grandmother. And they have chosen to depict different aspects of Dino petroglyphs, even in the construction of the headdress, over an artistic rendering of their loved one as a digital project. Now, of course, I spoke with Desan and did an interview, and they shared that historical texts coming from Europeans and mass media has really tried to paint a negative light of my ancestors in ways that dehumanizing, like making it seem as if our ancestors are being submissive and didn't fight back, which they did. The first rebellion against the Spanish was Taino peoples. Caciques known as Erenquilo, Garioca is his indigenous name, and Hatuye have proven that narrative to be false. Their presentations are always inaccurate, and that's why we have come into the web to dispel their inaccuracies. I feel the way studies have packaged our identities inaccurately use United States concepts to decide who is Indigenous. And when it comes to us Indigenous Caribbean people, blood quantum was never a thing for us, especially today, with how many of us are Afro-Indigenous peoples. This idea the West has associated with indigeneity, especially towards us, is beyond dehumanizing. I don't need to be full-blooded. There is no such thing to me. And this is a sentiment that was also echoed by April, who we just saw, because she is a Garifuna woman, but because of her lighter complexion, many people tend to doubt her claims. So this concept of what percentage of indigenous are you has been dispelled through the use of the arts. Desan also uses ceramics and beading as a way of reclaiming their culture. So they said that my understanding stems from my own experiences and listening to what many other communities have had to go through and faced. I get a nuanced picture of how many of our communities are affected by unique but extremely similar struggles, and it helps me unpack global issues and systematic oppression in our communities. And when I asked him, have the creative arts played a role in understanding your Indigenous identity, he said yes. I started making jewelry, and this is the type of jewelry that they've made, to incorporate my weaving skills, which also helps me feel more connected to my ancestors, as well as the art I make. I made portraits of my mom and my grandmother, Akutu. Now we're going to look at another individual here, who, this is Gary August, who I met at UWI actually. And I knew that Gary is Kalinago, but when I first approached him about the concept of this project, he said, I don't know. I don't really feel connected to my Kalinago culture. I don't think that I am Kalinago. I don't think that I'm an accurate representation of Kalinago people from the island of Dominica. And what's interesting about that is that Gary planned his whole degree around viewing how Kalinago communities in Dominica, specifically their forested communities, have been taken advantage of. So Gary, who didn't think that he was quote unquote Kalinago enough, dedicated his life's work to advocating for biodiversity and sustainability within the Caribbean region. And he's using the conservation biology, and he credits media, creative arts, and the sciences for his increased interest and passion in his Kalinago culture. And one of the important questions that I wanted to ask Gary, since he had so many um, reasonings as to why he's not a quote unquote good Kalinago, I said, is there any point where you are uncertain of your Indigenous identity, and what lived experiences have influenced this uncertainty? And he said, my sense of identity has always been unwavering. From a young age, I was instilled with the understanding that we are, quote unquote, Carib people, with a rich heritage of once ruling not only our island, but also parts of the Caribbean. This knowledge was a constant reminder never to forget our historical significance. During my teenage years, there was a collective desire within our community to reclaim our original name, Kalinago, rather than being identified with the term Carib, which carried colonial connotations related to cannibalism. Adapting to this change took some time, as in our childhood we are unaware of the term Caribs was incorrect. Overcoming that initial uncertainty and embracing the name Kalinago has been a journey of reclaiming our identity and heritage. Now I'm going to show you two more individuals. This right here is my beloved elder, Miss Eleanor Castillo Bullock. Miss Eleanor Castillo Bullock, affectionately called Miss Ellie, is Garifuna. She was born in Dangriga, Belize, and raised in the USA. She lived and attended school in St. Albans, Queens, New York, and attended and graduated from Syracuse University with a major in visual and performing arts. She uses her training in visual and performing arts to teach and train primarily Garifuna children and young adults the Garifuna language, music, and dance in an effort to promote, protect, and preserve our Garifuna culture, often returning to St. Vincent to teach Garifuna language, which is endangered and facing extinction. Now, Miss Ellie. Miss Ellie, actually, these are depictions of her Garifuna workshop in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2023. At this Garifuna workshop, it became full circle. I was teaching at the National Public Library with my dear friend, J.K. Mars, and we had the opportunity to take our students that we were teaching Garifuna to her workshop in another part of the island. The image on the right is a prayer circle. Here, Garifuna people tend to join pinkies, and we stand in the circle and we sing the Our Father prayer in Garifuna. It was one of the most beautiful moments because language is also an art. And recognizing that the children I was able to teach and the children Miss Ellie was able to teach were able to communicate with each other and convene together in this sacred circle using language, that was a full circle moment. Now, Miss Ellie, ironically, said that there was a point in time where she was uncertain about her Indigenous identity. And that time was when her family had migrated to the United States and her siblings had worked very hard to assimilate to African American friends. They did their best to hide where they were from for a long time. Additionally, she says, when my siblings arrived in the United States, we were mistreated by our school colleagues who knew we were migrants. For some reason, they probably knew because of the way we dressed, and she wasn't sure. The African Americans were mean to me. They would constantly say to my face, you need to get back on the boat and go back to where you came from. And my question to her was, what are your comments on how they have decided to package Caribbean Indigenous identities for consumption and study? And she said, "It hurts me when I see how the Caribbean Indigenous identities are still presented today, because Caribbean people are still packaged today as singing, dancing, or as shake our ass individuals, as opposed to packaging the Caribbean to exhibit our strength, our resilience, our intellect, that we are educated, and that we hold positions of power, Chief Sanford, in our community, in our Caribbean countries. Honestly, we never see that. We are mainly packaged and shown during a carnival celebration in which our Caribbeans are dressed half naked, looking like sex objects only. In all honesty, I'm really tired of seeing that type of Caribbean Indigenous presentation." And she says that, "I believe that the creative arts are very important in documenting Indigenous history, particularly because our Garifuna history in the past was not written by Garifuna people. Such is the case for all Indigenous communities in the region. And more important, our Garifuna language is an oral language. It was never written down. And I can attest to this, because I remember, and I'm still learning Garifuna. I remember when I had just started learning, and two of my elders, Miss Georgette Lambie, three of my elders actually, Miss Georgette Lambie, Miss Christine Vernon, and Mr. James Lovell, they had an argument over how to say the word dog in Garifuna, simply because there is also a male and a female version of Garifuna language. Because it was never written down, there are discrepancies in certain pronunciations and even definitions. And as Miss Ellie said, therefore, documenting it through visual and performing theater arts is imperative to teaching about the culture, and particularly to teach the language which has been lost in the Caribbean altogether. Now I'm going to show you one last person, and this is Clio, or Claronique Durant. Clio is a spirited photographer and educator from the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the village of Fancy. Her work and love for all things nature comes to life in her films and photographs on the page Durantography. As someone who is learning about her Garifuna culture, Clio takes classes to learn the language, music, and culture, which she passes on to the students at her school. And I must say that the school that Clio works at, located in Fancy, is one of the most progressive schools in St. Vincent in terms of learning Garifuna culture. Because keep in mind, our language, our culture, our history are still not being taught in our formal school system. Clio's school and her principal have been very, very adamant about teaching Garifuna language and history to students. So within Clio's classroom and the classrooms of many other teachers at her school, they have chosen to put up charts depicting regular things like ABCs, months of the year in both English and Garifuna. Now, a Vincentian cassava story. This is the story of Clio and some of her students. Garifuna communities in St. Vincent and the Grenadines have a strong cultural connection to cassava, or as we say in Garifuna, ereba. It is a staple food in their cuisine and is still being cultivated in their communities today, but this crop not only provides sustenance, it also tells the story of Vincentian history and continues to bond families and communities. This is a Vincentian cassava story. This is a short film that was produced by a group called Efemi, Ambition in Garifuna, whose members also include Clio, Brandon, Geraldine, and they were pivotal in getting this information out there. Clio has documented her students throughout the years, and this is a photo of students of the Fancy Government School, which is located in a Garifuna community in St. Vincent, and these students are at an independence rally. Now, Clio says SVG, known to the Garifuna people as Yurme, is their homeland. However, In my school days, I was not privy to the knowledge of Garifuna as my students are today. And SVG is an island nation, lost most of its Garifuna heritage due to colonization. However, I'm proud to say that the students at my school are aware of their Garifuna heritage and are learning to speak Garifuna as well as know a few songs in the native language. I would like to think that this is how our ancestors also congregated, she says, musing at a group of Garifuna men who were gathered at the riverside. And just as how this group of men consists of farmers, fishermen, and their groups consisted of men with various roles. She also depicts the making of bam bam, or cassava bread, known to most. She says that these pictures symbolize the modernization of traditions. This traditional dish, cassava bread, ereba, aka bam bam, is being baked over open flames, powered by charcoal, but the tools being used to support this baking process alludes to the modernization of our traditions. At least, we do not lose the food side of our heritage, and although some methods have been modernized, some methods still stay the same. She says, for example, madongo, made from arrowroot starch, is being prepared to be baked on the banana leaf that you see here in this photo. No foil paper around here, sustainability all the way. And to keep the Garifuna heritage alive, we must teach the children. Because keep in mind that cooking is also an art. Involving our children in our food practices and the culinary arts is something that we need to look more into as Indigenous people of today, especially with climate change. We need to ensure that our next generation lives beyond sodas and processed foods. And as one of my elders have said, when we cook and when we harvest, the reality of it is that we're eating our ancestors. The sugars from the cane fields within the Caribbean, the rum that we consume, the corn. We are not just eating our histories, we're eating their livelihoods. We're eating the entire makeup of our families. And that is something that we also need to be mindful of. With that, I would like to say a hearty thank you for allowing me to present today. Sereme to everyone for listening, and I hope that you were able to learn something from this presentation.